right, everyone. Welcome back from the break. For those of you just joining, my name is Mitzi Oku, and I am the MC of the We're the Black Designers Conference, as well as the founder. And it is time for our spotlight section, where we will be spotlighting speakers with unique perspectives and crazy interesting voices, such as our first graciously elegant speaker, who is a PhD student at Indiana University studying African American and African diaspora studies. She will be presenting her research that centers around the ways in which race and gender are perceived sonically in the US. Please welcome my amazing childhood friend, Kennedi Johnson.
Thanks, Mitzi, and thanks for putting this together. I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you. How are you?
I'm good.
So how are you gonna change the world today on this fine Saturday afternoon / morning / evening?
Well, I want to begin a discussion to try to think through or reimagine or just imagine a world where there are spaces for Black women specifically to use their totality of voice. So that's what I hope to accomplish with this paper today, or that I'm going to be reading to y'all.
Yeah, that's awesome. So with that, I will jump out of here and let you get to it.
Okay.
Bye.
All right, hi y'all. So my name, as Mitzi said, is Kennedi Johnson. I'm studying ethnomusicology and Black studies here at IU. And like, I know that you guys are focusing on the visual, it seems like predominantly, but I also, being an ethnomusicologist, I'm interested in the sonic. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about those ways that Black folks are perceived, mainly Black women, are perceived sonically through racialized listening. So some of the objectives that I hope to get through in 15 minutes is just to describe what racialized listening is and where I'm getting that from, walk through Misogynoir, discuss Misogynoir, coined by Moya Bailey, Controlling Images by Patricia Hill Collins, also thinking about what racialized listening looks like in practice and what those effects are. And then think through a space in which Black women can be heard and can use their totality of voice. And one of those ways I was thinking of is intersectional active listening. So hopefully we get through all of that. So like a few disclaimers, if you will. So like I have an interest in the sound and how ideas of Blackness are not only tied to the visual, but the sonic as well, as I said earlier. But there are some scholars who definitely pay attention to this, but we tend to ignore these sonic elements of racism as a collective. So my focus on this paper will largely be how racialized listening, my focus in this paper is largely on how racialized listening takes place in spaces of education, mainly because that's my research. However, this obviously applies to other corporate spaces, businesses, and so on. So let's see. Also, I'm focusing on Black girls, women, femmes here because of my own positionality as a Black woman in the United States and my commitment to engaging and realizing Black feminist thought. So my thinking here with focusing on Black women, girls, femmes, is it aligns with the Combahee River Collective's belief that, quote, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression, those systems being racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism. Lastly, this idea of listening being tethered to anti-Black misogyny should expand to thinking through the ways in which we hear other categories, such as sexuality, foreignness, and other racial categories as well. Lastly, this idea of intersectional active listening that was actually put forth by one of my colleagues here at IU, Allie Martin. She just got her PhD, has decolonizing possibilities that I think should definitely be explored in spaces if we're to be committed to Black lives or anti-racism. All right, so now getting into the paper. So the reason why I got interested in this or began thinking about this actually stemmed from my time student teaching. there's one moment I would like to describe that's like the basis for this whole intellectual project, I guess. I did student teaching in Macon, Georgia in 2017 in a music education classroom. The school was predominantly Black and brown, but the supervising teacher, the person I student taught under, was a white woman. She had a habit of always punishing Black and brown students way harsher than she would with white students. In other words, white students were allowed to be children, Black and brown children, students were not. They were seen as something to be controlled. So one moment I would like to describe that has stuck with me to this day was when I was continuing a lesson with a third grade class on the form of a song. Since I had not seen this class for a week, I wanted to see if they remembered the name of the form, which was a rondo. One of the students, who was a Black girl, excitedly responded with the correct answer. She was joyful and full of pride that she was the one to get that answer right. So I began to invite her to keep speaking and kind of use that moment for her to teach us. However, neither of us had the opportunity to continue. Seconds after that student answered the question, my supervising teacher barged out of the storage closet demanding that that girl stop being sassy and disrespectful. I was shocked. After the class left the room, my supervising teacher told me that I needed to learn to have control over a classroom and to not let students speak to me rudely. Over the last few years, I have frequently returned to this moment and asked myself, what was it that made my supervising teacher register something as innocent as excitingly answering a question as an act of insubordination or sass? This essay then will attempt to unpack not only this moment, but the shared experiences of Black women and girls through an examination of racialized listening. Being constantly misheard and denied the right of voice and expression is common to the experience of Black women in the US. Racialized listening practices result in the policing of the Black body and a denial of humanity. To discuss these racialized listening practices and their effects, I will engage with ideas of controlling images, sound studies, and autoethnography. Lastly, I consider the ways in which we can transform workplaces, classrooms, and so on into liberatory spaces through Black feminist thought, critical pedagogy, and intersectional active listening. So to begin, the idea of racialized sound, hearing, and listening is derived from Jennifer Stover's book, The Sonic Color Line. I think I have the book somewhere behind, anyway, it doesn't matter. Anyway, Stover writes that, quote, US white supremacy has attempted to suppress, tune out, and willfully misunderstand some sounds in their makers in history, end quote. Stover's argument is that racism as it exists within the United States has depended upon the sonic as much as it has depended upon the visual. Quote, far from being vision's opposite, sound frequently appears to be visuality's doppelganger in US racial history, unacknowledged but ever present in the construction of race and the performance of racial oppression. Sound has been entangled with vision since the conception of modern ideas of race, and it has often operated at the leading edge of the visual to produce racialized identity formations. So she details the ways in which print media and other technologies were essential to the construction of Black sound. She writes that essentialist ideas of Black sounds and listening offered white elites a new method of grounding racial abjection in the body, while cultivating white listening practices as critical, discerning, and delicate, and above all, as the standard of citizenship and personhood. Another argument that Stover makes that's crucial to this paper in the Sonic Color Line is that hearings or listenings or the ways that we do that in this country are not only race, but also gender. So think here about the angry Black woman stereotype versus white women always being heard as innocent, quiet, soft, feminine. I'm kind of thinking through one of the latest incidents with Amy Cooper in Central Park. But anyway, the next question then is, what are the visual stereotypes of Black women and girls that these sonic understandings of Blackness are attached to? So before delving into those images and anti-Black misogyny, these sonic understandings are attached to, I think it's important to first just debrief intersectionality and how I understand it. So just in case you aren't familiar, intersectionality is a term and theoretical framework initially coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and it has proved useful for a number of activists and scholars for thinking through the ways in which uh, one's various social and political identities intersect. So I bring intersectionality up here, not only because I'll be talking about intersectional active listening, but also it's essential to our understanding of misogynoir, right? And also controlling images. So onto controlling images. Controlling images comes from Patricia Hill Collins. She's a sociologist, Black feminist. Um, and she introduces us to that concept in her seminal work, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. In the chapter, Mammies, Matriarchs, and Other Controlling Images, Colin talks about the ways in which Black women have been stereotyped into specific categories or images as a means of control. She begins by writing that intersecting oppressions of race, class, gender, and sexuality could not continue without powerful ideological justifications for their existence. According to Collins, these controlling images essentially exist on the scale from Mammy to Jezebel. So a description of what those are. So the mammy, the first of the controlling images Collins discusses, can be generally characterized as the faithful, obedient domestic servant who knows her place and is content with her subordination. On the other hand, the matriarch is considered to be the mother figure who is unfeminine, overly aggressive, or assertive and emasculating. An example of the mammy, I guess in recent pop culture, would be Aunt Jemima. That's a mammy figure. But lastly, the Jezebel is a stereotype that characterizes the Black woman as hypersexual and naturally so. As Colin reminds us, these differences are typically defined by oppositional terms. So in other words, Black women are either seen as the matriarch or the mammy, a Jezebel, or as asexual. There is little to no room for a Black woman to be an individual and exist outside of these stereotypical boxes. This understanding of difference in terms of dichotomous categorization is also important in thinking about the ways in which Black women and girls are read as either being good or bad, sassy or ladylike, quiet or loud, assertive or aggressive. By using Collins and Stover's arguments, we might be able to see how racism is injected into the listening practices of educators, administrators, bosses, colleagues, and coworkers. So a description of misogynoir, and then we'll get into examples. So as we may know, these images described by Collins are directly linked to ideas of misogynoir. Just a background on that term, misogynoir was coined by a queer Black feminist scholar, Moya Bailey, in a 2010 Crunk Feminist Collective blog post. As one may be able to deduce, the word combines the words misogyny and noir. Misogyny can be defined as contempt or prejudice directed towards women, while the latter half, simply put, is the French word for Black. However, it also has roots in film noir, typically dark sexualized crime films. Essentially then, misogynoir describes the anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women experiences. She conceptualized this term around the portrayal of Black women in, quote, racial visual violence she was seeing in popular culture throughout history. Bailey says the following about the necessity of inventing such a word and the way it may be applied. Quote, for me, naming misogynoir was about noting both an historical anti-Black misogyny and a problematic intra-racial gender dynamic that had wider implications in popular culture. Misogynoir can come from Black men, white men, and women, and even Black women. Another blogger, Trudy, who's a womanist scholar and blogger, further did some definitional work on that term if you want to look that up. So as we've seen from Bailey's writing, misogynoir is not to be appropriated by women of color or white women. It is a term that is specific to Black women's experiences of misogyny and anti-Blackness. So that was a lot of definitional work. I just wanted to make sure we're all in my brain and how I'm thinking about this. So now some examples of like what racialized listening looks like are further examples, because I already provided one at the beginning. So in his essay, Ladies or Loudies, Perceptions and Experiences of Black Girls in Classrooms, Edward Morris talks about how these controlling images and misogynoir shows up, and then how they're perceived sonically in these ways. So he's looking to understand the, quote, unique educational perceptions and obstacles Black girls face in schools. He noticed that a number of teachers encourage students to exemplify a docile form of femininity and wanted them to act like ladies. As we'll see, their idea of ladyhood is problematic at best. It's rooted in whiteness, but we'll get to that. I'm jumping ahead of myself. At the time, however, most teachers viewed the existing femininity of these girls, the Black girls, as coarse and overly assertive, leading one teacher to describe them as loudies. This form of femininity was certainly predicated on white supremacist patriarchal interpretations that leave little to no room for other understandings of the feminine. This is also talked about in Patricia Hill Collins' Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender, and the New Racism. She writes that, quote, middle-class heterosexual white femininity as our society believes middle-class heterosexual white femininity is the normative, whereas Black femininity is considered to be subordinated, a subordinated gender identity that becomes constructed not just in relation to white women, but also in relation to multiple others, namely all men, sexual outlaws, who she describes as prostitutes, are people who don't fit in the gender binary, are not heterosexual, unmarried women, and girls. Therefore, when a girl, particularly a Black girl, steps outside of these desired performances of ladylike behavior, Morris found that they were often punished for being too loud, unladylike, or behaving and dressing like a, quote, hoochie mama. This also kind of complements what we see in Arnett Ferguson's book, Bad Boys, Public Schools in the Making of Black Masculinity. In this book, Ferguson talks about adultification, whereas Black boys are not allowed to be seen as children. They are adultified, right? They're not given permission for mistakes or for acting like a child because they are already viewed as deviants in society. Even though her focus is on Black boys, Black girls are also subject to forms of adultification, and it differs from that of Black boys, mainly in terms of hypersexualization. So what stood out to me in Morris's essay is this idea that education is that the education is less important than correcting the girls' choices in clothing or correcting their way that they speak or their mannerisms. So we see that it's important for educators to mold Black girls into young ladies, in addition to subtly and sometimes unwittingly molding them into less active and enthusiastic learners, which is one of the effects of this racialized listening. This is not discussed in Morris's essay, but we also see a lot of Black girls being described as sassy. So like this perceived aggressive femininity and a ladylike behavior labeled as sassy. This is discussed in here. How much time do I have? This is discussed in, okay. Mitzi told me not to be alarmed. I have 5 minutes. It's okay. So yeah, it's also seen in this book called Ruth Nicole Brown, Here Are Truths. She writes that teachers, parents, and community workers are quick to offer anecdotes about Black girls as in need of management because of what they say and how they say it. The how is often perceived as sassy. Ruth Nicole Brown actually does some work to unpack what sassy actually means and how in like Black community, sassy is not always a bad thing. Anyway, I'm gonna jump ahead because I don't have much time. Okay. Yeah. So I guess some questions that I have from all of that I was talking about is like, how can we provide a classroom space where Black girls aren't choked into silence, a space where Black girls can speak freely without fear of being sonically policed, misunderstood, or punished? And how can we create a space where Black girls feel safe and able to use the totality of their voice, their expression, and their range of emotions and their self? So what will this space look like in today's society, a society that has not truly dealt with its racist past and present? So one concept that I think is important to understand for this is intersectional active listening. Intersectional listening itself was coined by, again, my friend, Allie Martin. Oh, okay. Allie Martin. I'll just define that and then I'll be quiet. So it's she describes it as, let me find that quote, an intentionally speculative mode of listening that challenges us to hear multiple axes of analysis. She writes that this refutes the consideration of only race, class, or gender, instead encouraging a listener or a listening practice that refuses the language of either or and instead lives within the both and. So while her study is focused on gentrification in DC, she argues that intersectional listening has the ability to transform the way that we hear Black life, which I believe is essential to how we can begin to address racialized listening practices in general and affirm the humanity and girlhood of Black girls and women. Okay, I'm done, Mitzi. You can cut me off.
Kennedi, way to put me on blast like that in front of thousands of people about the message. But it's okay. This was amazing. I really love how you gave the anecdote of your observation in an early childhood classroom, because I really think that it drives the point home that systematic racism and the constraint of who Black people are and who they want to be fundamentally starts at the early stages of childhood. So thank you for highlighting that. And I want to thank you so much for speaking. And I loved your presentation and I'm very proud of you. So
I'm proud of you. I love you.
oh, me too. So I'll see you later. I'll text you or call you after this. All right. So